Star Wars: The Clone Wars Season 2 concluded 14 years ago in April of 2010, just 1 year after the first season concluded. Going into production of Season 2, the crew of The Clone Wars now had a whole season under their belt. With this extra experience, was the team at Lucasfilm Animation able to improve on the first season, or did Season 2 fall short? This is part 2 of a 7-part video series where I go through each season of The Clone Wars and discuss the many aspects of them. From the characters, to the arcs, to the creators, to the production, I'm gonna cover as much as I can. Because even after the series concluded back in 2020, there is still so much to discuss. If you haven't already, I'd go check out part 1 of this series where I go through the first season of The Clone Wars. But if you're all caught up, let's travel back in time to 2009 and look at the production of Season 2 of The Clone Wars. Now, because production of Season 2 began before Season 1 even finished airing, there wasn't that much that changed between the seasons. And this will pretty much be the case until we get to Season 6. In my section of Season 1, I spoke about how limited Lucasfilm Animation actually was when developing that season. So many of the featurettes of Season 1 mention how the crew had to find ways to save money. Some examples of this were reusing existing assets in new and creative ways. Now, it was also mentioned how towards the end of the season, the team at Lucasfilm Animation drastically increased its size. I was unable to find any specific numbers when it came to the team of Lucasfilm Animation or the budget, but if you notice in Season 1, the later episodes don't only look better, but they're also a lot more expansive than before. For any of you who are into sports, you would know that usually an athlete improves a lot from their rookie year to their second year. This is because in their rookie year, there's more to learn than just the sport. There's other factors at play that said athletes never considered. The same applies to TV shows. Lucasfilm Animation was really figuring out what worked and what didn't work with Season 1. Towards the end of the season, they seemed to have figured out their groove. So now that Lucasfilm Animation had this new and improved team going into Season 2, they were really able to push the boundaries. Right off the bat, you could notice that what the animators were able to put on screen was a lot more expansive than what came before. And I don't necessarily mean just more assets on the screen. I'm talking about the locations, the number of locations, and the scale of these locations. Geonosis was a 4-episode battle that simply would not have been possible to make in Season 1. There were dozens of characters, a variety of locations, multiple environments within these locations, and new and impressive visual effects within this arc alone. If we go back a few episodes to the episode Children of the Force, this episode alone takes us to more locations than entire arcs were able to take us in the previous season.
First thing I asked was, why isn't this 2 episodes? Because there's just so much going on. We're jumping to so many different planets, and there's so many different characters. I just wondered how it was all going to somehow fit together.
Maybe the most impressive feat of animation this season was the Zillo Beast 2-parter. The Zillo Beast alone was something that Filoni said was a major challenge for the team. And things only got more difficult when George asked Dave to have the Zillo Beast go to Coruscant.
And George says, yeah, so at the end of this, they're gonna take it on a ship back to Coruscant, like King Kong. And I was just like, of course.
Now, it wasn't just the scale that drastically improved from last season to this season, but also the smaller details that most of us wouldn't notice right away. A big emphasis for the crew of Lucasfilm Animation this season was to improve facial expressions, and I think this was a wise choice. In Season 1, especially in the early episodes, a lot of the characters look stiff. It's as if they all got Botox and no longer have any facial muscles. Season 2 was a noticeable improvement on this front. One of the best examples of this was how the animators had to animate Dr. Ball from the Zillo Beast episodes. Because she didn't have a human face, it was a bit more challenging for the team, but it all worked out.
I talked to the animators and I wanted them to concentrate on like, okay, when is that moment where we first see the feelings underneath kind of break through? Her shoulders just subtly relax and she might just start to blink a little bit more and look down, and and gather her thoughts.
Other minor details that the animators were able to add were all the dirt on the characters during the Geonosis episodes. Supposedly creating a waterfall or a lava fall is quite challenging, but the team was able to do that. The shivering of Ahsoka during the Brain Invaders episodes was not an effect that could have been done in season 1, but they were able to do that here. Now, besides visual improvements, a big focus for Filoni was improving the sound design of each episode. Sound is just as important as the visuals, and Filoni was able to recognize that.
So that's just a bunch of snarls, and they're just kind of pitched and layered on a keyboard and performed in a way to make it sound like it's more vocal. So
there are plenty of other visual or sound effects that I can talk about. That's why I highly recommend you guys check out the Clone Wars featurettes when you get the chance. They have a great look into the minds of the crew, along with sharing little details that you would have definitely never noticed. There are even featurettes where Filoni would answer fan questions. That would be so awesome if Lucasfilm did stuff like this today. Outside of production design, where Season 2 also made a big shift was how it crafted its arcs. The Clone Wars is well known for having multiple episode arcs that can really expand a story in a way a single episode couldn't. Season 1 had multiple arcs, but Season 2 was the first season to have a 4-episode arc. And if you really want to include the Senate spy episode, the Geonosis arc is really 5 episodes. Most of the episodes in Season 1 were quite basic. Separatists are doing something bad to some system, and our Republic heroes must stop them. A lot of those arcs had comically evil villains too. None of that is here in Season 2. We have an arc involving a bounty hunter trying to steal info. We have conspiracies with the Mandalorians. We have a few episodes that involve attempted political assassinations. There's an episode about training farmers against bounty hunters. There's an arc about a Star Wars version of Godzilla. And the season wraps up with a kid wanting revenge on a Jedi. The only standard Republic vs Separatist arc this season is the Geonosis battle. But even then, that's the Republic invading a Separatist planet rather than the good guy versus bad guy stuff we got in Season 1. But it's also not just the types of conflicts we got this season, but the genres as well. We have multiple detective stories, we have a heist episode, we have zombie episodes, there are political thriller episodes, and there's a damn kaiju arc. Filoni spoke about how this season he wanted to capitalize on those arcs and have them be as different as possible. We all know that George Lucas loved making all his movies as different as possible, and Dave Filoni seemed to pick up on that and experiment with the Clone Wars as well.
This was one of the most bizarre story meetings I've ever had with George. We go in there to get these ideas, and George was doing a lot of genre pictures in Season 2. We had kind of a Body Snatchers episode, we had Zombies episode, we had the Murder Mysteries, and out of nowhere, he hits me with this, let's face it, it's Godzilla.
Now, as great as the animation is, or how interesting the arcs are, at the end of the day, it's about the execution that matters. So let's dive deep into the many arcs and episodes of Season 2. Multiple times throughout my Season 1 section, I stated that the main objective of the Clone Wars was to expand the prequels. Now, Season 1 did this in a lot of ways, but none of them exceeded expectations. It tried a lot of different things. Some episodes focused on theme, some focused on plot, some focused on character, and some focused on nothing at all. Where Season 2 is much different is its consistency with its approach. Season 2, I would argue, is a lot more character focused than anything else. And of course, that doesn't mean that nothing else was explored, but as you'll see in a second, character was the main focus of this season. Eventually, the Clone Wars gets really good about exploring mature and dark themes, but through Season 2, it hasn't really gotten there yet. Some arcs do tackle some of these issues, like the Zillo Beast arc tackles moral questions about what to do with wildlife, especially when it's endangered. The Deserter episode brings up questions about war and choosing your own destiny, but other arcs missed an opportunity to explore these powerful themes while also maintaining its character development. In the final arc of the season, the one with Boba Fett, there's a lot of discussion around kids and their role in war. At the end of the day, a major theme of this show was how pointless the war all was. So you'd think that the topic of sending kids to war would be discussed a bit more seriously, but that's completely glossed over here. If anything, the episode tries to paint these kids going to war as more of a good thing because they're there to help fight alongside their brothers. This is where later seasons really start to shine. shine. But clearly the story isn't there yet in season 2. Now, since the season is clearly more focused on the characters, let's discuss the characters. The one who gets the most development this season, I would argue, is Ahsoka. Almost the entirety of the first half of the season includes her in some way. Season 1 gave Ahsoka a lot of qualities that allowed fans to root for her, qualities that were lacking in the Clone Wars movie. Those qualities are still ever present here. There's a handful of moments this season where Ahsoka tries to help someone out and is just told to screw off. It makes us feel bad for her, because no one wants to be yelled at for being kind. Maybe the most underrated aspect of Ahsoka in these episodes is how much adversity she faced. Throughout the season, Ahsoka is constantly put through the ringer and comes out on top. Here are just a handful of things she experienced this season. Almost got blown out of an airlock, chose to sacrifice herself and was buried deep in the ground after an explosion, almost got invaded by zombie worms, almost froze to death, got her lightsaber stolen, and almost got killed by a handful of bounty hunters. And these events only continue on as the series progresses. The reason it is so important that your characters face adversity is because we respect people who can endure through that kind of stuff. I have a take about women in action movies or shows that I want to share. So often the writers want us to believe the women are as capable as the men, but at least physically the women almost never endure as much. You guys know I'm not one to crap on the sequels, but it's the first example that comes to mind. Rey has a lot of emotional trauma throughout these movies, but physically the worst thing that ever happens to her is that she gets a cut on the arm by a Praetorian guard. Yeah, I know she dies, but that was because of Force semantics, not because she was killed. Meanwhile, through all these movies, her counterparts in Finn and Kylo Ren get beaten up constantly. I am not trying to say that I want to see women get beaten up. Please don't interpret my message that way. What I am trying to say is that when the story shows us that both the men and the women can get the shit kicked out of them and that they'll both be okay, then we actually believe the writers when they say the women are as capable as the men. However, when you watch a series of films where all the men get beaten up but never the women, it at least leads me to believe the writers don't actually think the women can handle that type of violence. I recently watched Arcane for the first time, and the women in that show get beaten up to high hell. No one questions how tough Vi or Jinx are. In The Legend of Korra, there's an entire arc about Korra getting beaten up so badly that she was put in a wheelchair and needed 3 years to recover. You may not like this show, but no one can question how tough Korra is. Ahsoka belongs in this category as well. Mind you, Ahsoka in the beginning of the Clone Wars is only 14 years old, yet she almost dies a handful of times. Some of us may dislike Ahsoka, but none of us can question how tough she is. Season 2, a lot more than Season 1, really emphasizes this. Now, of course, making a character tough is not the only way to develop someone. What Season 2 does a lot of is foil Ahsoka with other characters. And of course, the major one is Anakin. Almost every time Anakin gives Ahsoka a lesson, it's a great scene. There's also a scene where Ahsoka gives Anakin a lesson. The scene where she tells Anakin patience instead of chasing after Cad Bane. Ahsoka is a young girl who needs a lot of guidance in her life, so seeing her learn from Anakin is great stuff, especially since these lessons are usually something kids watching the show can learn as well. The best example of this was at the end of the Brain Invaders episode. Ahsoka had just been through an entire Geonosis battle where she almost died, and then just survived a bunch of zombies and almost froze to death. After this all happens, Ahsoka asks Anakin if she had done the right thing in letting Barriss live, and Anakin reassures her of her decision and everything that she had just been through. Filoni spoke about this moment specifically in one of the featurettes and why it was so important to him.
Anakin has this big sit down with Ahsoka and talks about it. And it's what you're supposed to do when a young person's been traumatized. I mean, that's a lot for her to go through. And I think that you need to see that. The kids need to see that, yes, there are, scary things out there. Yes, there are things that are going to challenge you.
Filoni was wise to put character first in this episode, and it definitely pays off in the long run. Now, of course, not everything with Ahsoka is her learning something. Her banter with Anakin is perfect. For one, the 2 counting kills reminds me of Legolas and Gimli, and a comparison to those two is always a good thing. But more importantly than that, we see how the 2 butt heads a lot. No relationship is perfect, and neither is theirs. But the foil between them and Luminara Luminara and Barriss highlighted the two's weaknesses but also their strengths. Barriss is the perfectly well-trained Padawan. She listens to her master and they never fight. This is obviously not like Ahsoka and Anakin, but when the two are trapped under all that rubble, it's Ahsoka's resilience that she learned from her master that saves them. Ahsoka and Anakin are certainly a peculiar pair, but they're also a really well-developed one. This leads me to Anakin. I continue to find it so baffling that Lucas said he didn't want this show to focus on Anakin all that much, because he gets so much development. Season 1 touched on this a bit, but Season 2 definitely highlights how emotional Anakin can get when it comes to the people he cares about. Of course, we see how dangerous he becomes when people he loves are in danger. This happens in the beginning when Cad Bane captures Ahsoka, but it was highlighted in a more effective way in the Geonosis arc. Seeing Anakin lose his mind at the thought of Ahsoka dying is a perfect way to develop his character. Contrasting Anakin with Luminara and how their views on loss differ just shows how flawed Anakin is. The only way the movies were able to highlight this characteristic of Anakin was with Padme and his mother, but because Padme's relationship with Anakin was so cringe, it was hard to buy into him turning to the dark side. Here we get a lot of that development with Ahsoka. This guy here I can totally buy would turn to the dark side to save his wife. Speaking of his wife, we see a bit of marriage struggles between Anakin and Padme. Anakin being overprotective of her is perfectly in character, but also him being jealous shows his insecurities, which someone like Anakin would realistically have. Anyone who has attachment issues usually exhibits insecure traits as well. What the storytellers did with Anakin this season was really smart. Now, I want to transition to Obi-Wan. I have a hot take about Obi-Wan. I never loved him as a character. Sure, he's funny and he's iconic, but he never had any real depth to him. Everything he does in these movies is because he made a promise to someone. He only agreed to train Anakin because Qui-Gon asked him to, not because of any personal reason. And then when Obi-Wan looks after Luke, it's because he promised Yoda he would, not because of any real personal desire. Now, the Obi-Wan show tries to tie his guilt over what happened with Anakin to his relationship with Luke. That was something I actually really liked, but that wasn't conveyed much in the prequels. Season 2 of The Clone Wars spends a whole arc developing Obi-Wan's relationship with Satine, a woman he supposedly loved at some point. The banter the two had with each other is just as funny as Obi-Wan's banter with Anakin. I love the teasing Anakin does towards Obi-Wan. It must make himself feel better about his love for Padme knowing his master, the perfect Jedi, once loved someone too. I think people criminally underrate how big of a moment it was when he told Satine he would have left the Order for her. Obi-Wan's entire character is being the perfect Jedi. To have the revelation that he would have left the Order for someone is a big deal. Honestly, Obi-Wan and Satine's relationship was probably the most character development we had ever gotten for Obi-Wan up to this point, and it's all great. I love the development of Ahsoka, Anakin, and Obi-Wan, but if you know me, you would know the development I found to be the most impressive in the entire series was everything to do with the clones. Filoni made a great point about how he wanted to develop the clones in this show. He stated that he wanted a lot of kids watching the show to relate with their individuality. A big issue kids struggle with is standing out and learning their place in everything. Having the clones put such an emphasis on standing out and having their own identity was a perfect way to tie in this theme. The variety of different clones we meet throughout the season are a big reason why we love the clones so much. The different personalities, the different armor, the different hairstyles, seeing each one stand out is so important. With the improved visuals of Season 2, the animators were able to give the clones a lot more of this variety. Now, the season doesn't have many clone-focused episodes. Season 1 had more of them, but Season 2 had the Deserter episode, an episode I find criminally underrated. The development for Rex here is more important than I think people give it credit for. Seeing Cut choose his own way in life opens Rex's eyes in a way it hadn't previously. Of course, Rex knows the true individuality of the clones, but this moment he took that to the next level. It's what likely allows him to get even closer to some of his 501st buddies later on. Towards the end of the season, showing the young clones for the first time was a refreshing way to develop the clones as a whole. Yeah, I wish they emphasized the horror of sending these kids to war, but the arc still developed that camaraderie nonetheless. Now that's pretty much it when it comes to the major part of the characters. Characters that weren't discussed yet I'll touch on in future seasons. Now there are other aspects of these episodes to discuss besides the themes and characters. One aspect of this season that was totally absent from the first season are plot lines that tie into future events. There's a lot set up here that has some serious ramifications in the future. The first arc of the season has to do with Palpatine wanting the location of Force-sensitive children. Why would he want this? Of course, to make sure no Jedi can return once they're all killed, but he also mentions the idea of raising his own dark side Force users. This is likely an early idea for the Inquisitors, even if it doesn't directly lead to that. This season introduces us to Barriss and her relationship with Ahsoka. This becomes increasingly relevant as the seasons progress. Barriss framing Ahsoka was a major part of her story, and then Barriss living through Order 66 and having her story play out in Tales of the Empire was important for Lucasfilm. When you look at the deeper motivations laid out in the Zillo Beast arc, there's lots of implications there too. Why would Palpatine be so interested in a material that can deflect lightsaber strikes? To make Order 66 more efficient. The arc also highlights how the Jedi Order itself is changing through the war.
They come up with this way of, well, all right, well, we're not going to kill it, but we're going to deceive the Dugs into thinking we killed it, and then we'll transport it out of here.
The Dugs would never know the difference.
You're so moral, you're doing some things that are a little immoral. I think it shows really more of where the Jedi are at in terms of the whole conflict and the war.
The episode also teases Palpatine wanting to clone the Zillo Beast, something that didn't pay off until well over a decade later. Now, maybe more important than anything was the introduction of Mandalore. At this point in the series, no culture or planet had been developed more thoroughly than the Mandalorians. Of course, there's Satine. We learn what kind of leader she is and what kind of Mandalore she hopes to build. Then we have the cult of Death Watch, the group that wants to restore Mandalore to its warrior-like roots. We meet Pre Vizsla, a prominent face of Death Watch and this cult of Mandalorians. Many of you probably already know this, but Pre Vizsla was voiced by Jon Favreau. When you listen to him and Filoni talk about the Mandalorians, it's no shock that the two ended up making a show about a Mandalorian a decade later.
I think the Mandalorians are probably the ones that the diehards are going to be most curious about.
Mandalore becomes such a critical part of not only this series, but so much of the Filoniverse, as some like to call it. Everything here is in service to some of the arcs later on, and this forward thinking in season 2 is one of its bigger strengths. If I had to criticize something about this season, other than the lack of thematic depth, there are a lot of silly coincidences in this season. In the first arc, the whole reason events are able to play out is because Yoda just happens to be able to sense things. Yoda just casually sits around and senses that there's a plot to infiltrate the Jedi Temple. And then later on, when they're searching for the holocron, they're able to just sense where the kids are being taken from. I never liked it when the Force could magically be used to solve any problem. And throughout this arc, Cad Bane is able to escape so many times on so many occasions. In the third episode alone, he escapes 3 times. How convenient is it that this guy is able to escape so easily so many times when no one else can escape from the Jedi? I guess besides Grievous. So it gets a bit silly up to a point. And then this next example is a really minor one, but it's one that comes to mind. In the Mandalore arc, they knock out Obi-Wan so they can hang him upside down and then crush him with these machines. Why not just kill him instead of stunning him? This silly stuff largely stems from the show being in its more juvenile era, which, you know what, is actually okay. I emphasized this in the last section on season 1, but shows should be allowed to grow and get better. Just look at the difference between season 1 to season 2 alone. The animation was much better and the character development was much better. But another underrated aspect of the Clone Wars is that the show is allowed to age with its audience. For some reason, a lot of people get annoyed when you say Star Wars is for kids, even though George Lucas himself has said this many times.
You know, it's a film for 12-year-olds.
Whenever I say the Clone Wars is a kids show, people again freak out and play clips of all the violence, especially the clip of Ahsoka decapitating a handful of Mandalorians. You'll notice that no one ever plays a clip from season 1 of the show for being too dark for kids. That's because Lucas and Filoni realized that they want the show to age with its audience. If you were 10 years old when season 1 came out, that means you were 15 when season 6 came out. No 15-year-old wants to watch a show for 10-year-olds. But because the Clone Wars was allowed to grow, it aged with its initial audience. It's what I call the Harry Potter effect, starting a story that is clearly for kids, but allowing said story to mature over time. And even in season 2, it gets a little bit darker. We see this one Jedi getting tortured to death. That's pretty dark. This is why it's so important that you let your shows last longer than one season. Don't bet your entire studio on the success of season 1. Season 1 should be the worst season of your series because you want it to get better. This is a big issue that I have with the streaming market these days, especially in regards to Netflix, canceling shows too early right as they were about to get good. Yeah, I get a big part of it has to do with viewership and ratings, but if you don't invest $230 million into the first season of your show, then you're not going to go bankrupt when viewership is a bit lackluster. Star Wars The Clone Wars was allowed to grow, and because of that, season 2 was a clear improvement from season 1. But that's just what I think. Let's see what the ratings say. Season 2 for some reason doesn't have any critical score on Rotten Tomatoes, but it does have an 86% rating from audiences. IMDb doesn't give individual scores for seasons, but if you were to average the 22 episodes from Season 2, you would get a score of roughly 7.67 out of 10, which would put it above Season 1's average rating of 7.35 out of 10. The highest rated episode according to IMDb was Landing at Point Rain with an 8.2 out of 10, and the lowest rated episode was Senate Murders with a 6.7 out of 10. Tune back in a couple days to see my breakdown of Season 3. But until then, thank you everybody so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to tonight the Clot Squad, and I will see you guys next time.